Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us at this last part of the first panel this morning. I am Mariano Bosch. I have two passionate participants in public policy. I have Carolina Trivelli from the Institute of Peruvian Studies, from the Ministry of Social Inclusion in Peru, Carlos Noriega, who is an economist, very well versed in public policy, very much in tune with the private sector, and one of the persons behind the pension reforms in Mexico. Welcome, Carolina. Welcome, Carlos. Today, we have seen some very passionate debates on social protection. We've gone over poverty alleviation programs, the importance of investing in human capital, health, education. In this panel, I'd like us to take a step back to talk a bit about the ideas behind the social protection model in other countries and how we take this conceptual model and make it more efficient in a way that promotes inclusive productivity. I think it's fair to say that as a whole, our social protection models currently do not afford protection, effective protection for all. In many cases, they create distortions in our labor markets. Let's not forget that more than half of the jobs in our region are in the informal market. And there's also a growing fiscal cost to a lot of these programs. If we look at trends in pension and health costs, that means there's very little space left in our government budgets for the things we saw in the previous panels, for example. So the first question, in your view, what is the most pressing matter for countries to achieve a more efficient model? Carolina. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Clearly, as we've heard this morning in the first panels, for many years we have been good at specific programs. We're good at having a nice program and getting impact out of that. But these scattered programs do not make for a social safety net that really protects people. I think that we really need to, in fact, take a step back and once again look at social protection from a more comprehensive view, from the idea of actually protecting people, everyone that needs that protection. And that should be done through a set of actions that have synergies, that work well with each other, with the tools that can help people overcome the situation that led to their need for help. That means looking at this package differently, a comprehensive set of programs. We shouldn't just be focusing on specific examples of isolated programs with individualized impact. Thank you, Carolina. This is an issue we speak a lot about at the IDB. This scattered approach where we have many programs, some of them targeting formal segments of the population, others informal. And with COVID, we've seen a further fragmentation of that approach. So I really want to zero in on that idea because I think it's critical when we talk about the future of social protection. Carlos, tell us, what are your views? You said that this panel is taking a step back vis-a-vis the other ones. I'll take a further step back from what Carolina is saying. What Carolina is saying is very critical in that what we need to do to make this happen is to have this infrastructure for social programs based on three pillars. First, fiscal space. All of these programs obviously need resources, but especially when we're talking about fiscal resources, we are creating a larger risk pool. Protection addresses risk. The larger that pool, the better. Second, technology. As Mariano quite correctly points out, inclusion is needed. We have tools that we need to deploy for inclusion. Technology as it stands today. Third, formalizing the job market that you've also mentioned, Mariano, because the informal labor market has impact not just on the future of the market itself, but those that are in that informal market are in fact very productive. They're human capital, but then there is another segment in the informal market. These are people that don't have access to Social Security, which is why programs to formalize the market is very important. Also, the aging of our population poses two significant challenges. One, health, when we think of chronic disease, which is much more costly, and second, pensions. The the amount of non-working age people and its growth means that we need to start thinking about protecting the elderly. You've brought up some complex, critical issues. Carolina's mentioned fragmentation of these programs. You've mentioned the fiscal space. How do we create fiscal space in order to have an effective program? Formalizing markets, that's very important for the region in order to have that fiscal space and to help our people. And one big trend that we've discussed a lot at the IDB is the extremely quick aging of our population, which is going to result in significant costs. We've been focusing on the what. I'd like to move on now to the next question, which is the how. How do we move forward on this agenda? How do we bring our programs together? How do we generate fiscal space? How do we make labor markets more formal? I would like to focus on some of the more critical issues like transparency, institutions, what we call the rule of law. How is it that these critical elements can help us make progress on this front? Carolina. Well, let's see. In order to make this happen, the first thing we need to do is to define the commitment, the threshold that we want to address with that package of social protection. Once we have that definition of that threshold level for programs, services, systems that we need to serve those who need social protection, the first thing we need is policy. That entails a negotiation. Without policies, that'll never happen. There's always someone in line for getting resources. Policy means politics, means negotiating, means gaining ground politically, and it means creating alliances. And these allies, and this ties into transparency, that means the users of these programs, those that will receive these services. Their voices are important not only for us to win this political battle or negotiation, but it's also important in order to identify or to be aware of what their needs are and to help governments put together that help package to demand a certain level of quality in those services, as well as to make sure that these packages are deployed appropriately. It's not just about reaching some and then getting out. It's about coming in and out, as we heard earlier, and that requires engagement from communities, from citizens, from local players. Without that, we will not have a social protection program, especially in countries where there are large informal labor markets. Excellent. Bringing in the user into this agenda for reform, that's very important. It's also not easy. How do we make civil society a part of this reform effort for our pensions and programs? Carlos, your experience. I think it really is about dotting the I's, right? How do you legitimize these programs? How do you empower the beneficiaries of these programs? Because the difference between the information that these individuals have, that they're looking out for their own benefit, and then the social side of this, where you have this interaction. Something that I experienced very closely was the pension reforms in Mexico from 1992 to date. And workers, for example, don't really feel any sense of ownership as leaders took part in the process for the policymaking process. It's critical. The same applies to governments. Governments have all of these programs, these assistance programs, and there's politics at play. So as we achieve transparency, clear rules for how these resources are used, that would help achieve transparency and give these programs legitimacy. Lastly, in order to be effective, it's very important to and I'm thinking about behavioral economics here, to look at, for example, getting a license and a passport and make the most of that. That serves to certify that one is registered for these programs, and that's very important. These programs need these additional elements in order to achieve the objectives at play. They need these complementary factors. So, as you're saying, the how sometimes is even more important than where we are headed. I would imagine everyone here knows where we're headed with this, but that question of how, that empowerment rather, that transparency, that rule of law is very important, and we need those mechanisms in place. Looking at the world of pensions where you come from, Carlos, do you think that what we've seen over recent years in the region, the creation of commissions that look at how to reform systems, is that an effective way to engage our citizens, or not necessarily so? I don't think it's enough. It's needed as an effort, but it's not enough. When we had the last pension reform in 2020 in Mexico, we did manage to have the law itself state that there would be a review of all of the indicators after 10 years. There was a very interesting panel on the experiences here, and the fact that these are experiments. All of these programs are experiments. As societies evolve, conditions change. So if we don't, from the onset, state we are going to review the effectiveness of these programs, if demographic, financial, statistical projections change, how do we change do we adapt these programs? That's a very important point. Another very important issue here is the universality of these programs. While it's true that in these experiments we need to be aware of the different needs of different population segments, and that risks are different depending on one's age, gender, or work situation, to the degree that we achieve universal coverage, that serves to let everyone know that anyone that faces these risks will have access to these benefits. So, in a changing world, in a world where change is picking up pace because of technology, because of changes in labor markets, and the speed at which financial resources move, it is important to carry out regular reviews of these programs. You touched an issue I'd like to bring up in my next question. Are we thinking about these reforms in a way that means making changes depending on what comes up in the future, changes in technology, in families, in labor markets? Is that the kind of reform that we're doing, or are we just focusing on urgent needs? Carolina. Well, I think one thing that we've learned over recent years, as Carlos was saying, is that local conditions, the conditions for certain social groups, all of that has an impact on what the state, what the governments can do. So one big challenge, going beyond reviewing what we've done and how to change it and making the most out of new technology. In addition to that, we need to get away from this idea, and I don't know when we took this on in the countries, that this idea that one policy fits all. We need to think about that idea some more, and we should look at having general policies that can be differentiated and customized depending on the user. And I think technology will let us do that in the future. And one place where we could go with this is where any citizen that needs access to social protection should be able to have access to different components of that social protection system that are aligned with their situation and their current conditions. And as that situation, their conditions change, their package of services, their package of programs should also change. That's where we need to go toward. Technology will help us, but that means that from the beginning, we need to establish national rules for these programs with different differentiated deployments depending on the locality, the person, the group. And that's something that we already know how to do. Few programs do it, but we already have some examples out there. And I think that we need to scale those programs up. That's a very interesting idea, and that goes to two issues we've been discussing here. We can work toward reducing the fragmentation of our systems, have a national system that is universal, applies to everyone, no differentiation between what's formal and informal, whether it's possible or not. And then technology can be our ally on that path. It's important in order to move toward these more holistic programs, more universal, as Carlos was saying. Technology can help us do today many things that we could not do 15, 20 years ago. Which leads me to my next question on flexibility. We know that our systems need to be more adaptable, more flexible, and that respond to future challenges that are unknown to us. One of those is climate change, as we saw in that first panel. How do our social protection systems have to start changing, given all of their imperfections, in light of these climate change shocks? Is there a role for the public sector, the private sector? How do we deal with that risk? How do we change our systems or adapt them? Carlos, we'll begin with you, and then Carolina. Very well. I've talked about technology before. I really insist on the importance of that. Two important areas under technology. One, access. With our phones nowadays, we can communicate, we can carry out financial operations, we can get support from these programs through our phones. Another part of that is how do we use the information that we have? An example from a project very much at a nascent stage in Mexico is micro insurance, parametric microinsurance. How does technology work? We can map out the locality. We can identify who lives where. We can get a sense of we can quantify the damage of a hurricane or earthquake, and then we can use that insurance in order to help those that were affected, and that is done with flexibility. As Carolina was saying, it's not good if you have the same thing for everyone, but when you have climate phenomena like this affect other ones, you can use this program, and that's an example of flexibility. It's coverage, protection from that risk, but it also lets you identify this person's income level, whether they're a producer, their level, their economic level. In other words, it establishes their level of vulnerability, so that the ability to adapt when it comes to climate change, that's a matter of concern for all. And last, and I'll wrap up the question with this, pension funds are more and more important. Pension funds in Mexico are at about 30% of GDP. In some more developed countries, it's even more than that. As the laws ask pension funds to start looking at their investments from a climate change standpoint, that means that pensions and social security is leveraged in order to start guiding pension investment. In England, it's been done for some time now. We've heard this in the United States too. Build back better, right? how do we come back from some incident toward a place where we have more sound infrastructure, more resilient to climate change. We have these government tools that can be conducive so that these pension funds, as well as health funds, so that these funds can get ahead of the impact of climate change. Undoubtedly, when we look at social protection and what happens when you have an unexpected climate event, and we have one in fact today in Peru, we always look at the emergency and working on that. The tents are put up, the water jugs, the food aid, all of that comes up, and that part works well in our countries. The private sector chips in, and that is more or less working. The problems start on day 10, where people no longer have housing, they don't have a way to make a living, they don't have any savings, any wealth, or any assets, and that's where we need a social protection program where it gets up and running after that state of emergency. We don't have that, and that's a program that needs an on-off switch. You turn it on when you need it, and you turn it off when you don't. But those are the programs that, as Maria Ibanez was saying, that helps when people are dealing with a disaster, that helps them avoid falling into the poverty trap. That needs to be a significant element in our social protection package as a whole. Along with that, our social protection systems as a whole need to take on early investment in terms of technology, working with the private sector for sources of savings, for assurances, for the cash needed for emergencies. And then two other things that are very important. Financial inclusion for all citizens. All citizens in our countries need to be brought into the financial system so that they can get immediate, safe, automatic aid, be that from the public sector, the private sector, from their family members who live elsewhere. Second, also, and the resources should be safeguarded, and then registering records. We saw this in COVID. Records can get obsolete very quickly, but we need record keeping that is streamlined, that is flexible, that is nimble, that uses blockchain, artificial intelligence, administrative data, data from our statistical institutes, so that we have information systems that during an emergency and especially after the emergency, so that we can provide a package of services to help families overcome that disaster. That needs to be mandatory in the design of any system like this in our region. Excellent. Really like that idea of technology being an ally. We saw this in some of the previous panels on poverty mitigation, how to be more efficient with health, education, social protection. It's very important. But another idea here that stands out is it's not just technology. There are some core reforms developing these new pillars, as you were saying, Carolina, where we look at social protection that helps us mitigate climate change. And then we have some pending reforms for pensions, health programs, which are so important. We have very little time left, but I don't want to end this without hearing some ideas from you. Someone previously mentioned a tweet or a hashtag. I don't know if we're going to get a tweet out of this, but what would you like to see for 2050 in terms of where the region should have advanced by then? Pick one thing, and what would you have liked to have seen happen in 25 years? I would like to see that social protection systems in our countries provide assurances for all citizens on two things: a threshold level of help for all, and second, it offers what citizens need. In other words, a menu of options where a citizen can choose what they really need in order to make a transformative change. Carlos. Almost all companies have a CFO, Chief Financial Officer, but the most successful companies have a Chief Future Officer, the person that looks toward the future. We're constantly reacting to things that have already happened. When there's been something unfortunate, when people have already fallen into poverty, I think governments need a chief future officer to identify not just future risks but future uncertainty. In a changing world, we don't know what people will be affected by. And I agree 100% with what Carolina is saying, but we need to have an open mind, looking toward the future, trying to identify emerging risks that will affect people, and have resources in place, have funds in place so that we can respond quickly in a sustainable fashion, as Carolina was very correctly pointing out. Thank you. Thank you all very much. Thank you, Carolina. Thank you, Carlos. We have described some of the big challenges posed for our health, education systems. I hope that this hour and a half has at least served to share some new ideas and some opportunities where we can improve. Thank you all very much.